Right, hello Bristol. It's wonderful to be back. So the remarks you heard about the Sanskrit talk will be on October the 11th. That's specifically about what I learned from a couple of years of doing Sanskrit, particularly which leads to some reflections on new readings of the Heart Sutra. So come along on October the 11th for that. This one is about my abiding interest in Madhyamaka philosophy, and I intend to show you what Madhyamaka dialectic looks like and demonstrate it live. Okay, that's the claim. No wires, no tricks. Yeah. So it's called The Beginning of Wisdom, Finding the Middle Way. And my aims here are to argue that our pursuit of wisdom is going nowhere except perhaps backwards, unless and until we have established and are using a basic understanding of logic. Which is, you might be surprised by that, but that's what I'm saying. Logic is really important, and I have to demonstrate why. And if you're sceptical about that, good, because that's a good philosophical attitude, yeah? Remain sceptical. I want to introduce Madhyamaka, which is Buddhism as philosophy. It's Buddhism as anti-philosophy and the total destruction of philosophy, actually, but that's a bit advanced. You treat it as philosophy, you'll be in the right bit of the ballpark. And I'm going to aim to show how Madhyamaka logic cuts through confusion to trigger insight. So this is definitely about triggering insight. I think insight is easier got than we're generally led to believe, and that quite basic understandings and learnings are also forms of insight. And insight itself, with a capital I, is only the same thing writ large. You already know how to learn. You know what flashes of insight are like. That's what big insight is like, but bigger. So it's different, but I want to make a connection with that to make it seem less remote. How Madhyamaka logic provides an antidote to ignorance, delusion, and muddled thinking generally, which I think all forms of philosophy can claim to do, and provides a solid foundation for the development of wisdom. So that's my claim, really. Get a grasp of logic, and you're in a much better position to be engaging with the development of your own wisdom. And I asked myself, why am I doing this? I wrote this paragraph quite late on, actually, because Nara Vera told me I had a bit less time than I thought, and so I sort of had to rewrite the talk. And as I said, it's actually better, I think, and you'll never know what the other talk would have been like. But I thought, well, why am I doing this anyway? And so what I've got here is, because as a young and a rather intense Buddhist, I'm now an old and rather intense Buddhist, I started to wonder about the transformation of duality into non-duality. I heard a lot about the subject-object duality around the LBC, where I started out. And what struck me is, how on earth can this be a gradual process? How can that, how can you do that gradually? Yeah? Given the apparent vast gulf between the two. So, there's a regular path of development. What? Leaping across infinite space. So I just couldn't see how that could be done. And I thought, well, I'll stick at that because I think there might be some answers. And then I heard someone say something about the Buddha throwing a bridge across the gap between the mundane and the enlightened experience. And I thought, okay, you can throw bridges across things in Buddhism then. And I also recalled the Buddha's parable of the raft. So there's a couple of technologies of transformation here across difficult spaces. That's probably about what I'm looking for. I figured that what I needed was a bridge, a raft, some way of getting across, and something rather less flimsy than a metaphor at that. Yeah? What I found was Madhyamaka. I think Madhyamaka is the bridge. Or it's one of them. Yeah? And in any case, it supports, because it's Buddhist philosophy, it supports any other way of doing Buddhism that you think might be the bridge, and it can't be separated from it. So it's sort of guaranteed to be true, that really. It seems to me that the real reason why anyone takes up Dharma practice is to deal with the dukkha. That's the real reason we do it. But when I first went along to London Buddhist Centre in '79, I was a psychology postgrad, and I was concerned about causality and research method, and so very curious indeed about what the Buddha had to say about cause and effect. An unusual reason for taking up Buddhism, causality. But of course it is central. And when I discovered it was a central aspect of the Dharma, I was very interested indeed, because I'd been looking at it in other areas. Now, whilst I've since learnt a thing or two about compassion, my yidam, after all, is Avalokiteshvara, and I'm on speaking terms with the Taras, she who ferries across, be it noted, ferrying across again, yeah? As well as star, two meanings in the Sanskrit. That concern for doing good, sound philosophy has never left me. Yeah? A very senior, venerable, and much-loved order member once told me that whilst wisdom and compassion are fundamentally inseparable, and we'll see why later, most people in the FWBO or Triratna are on a compassion path. And whilst I appeared to this person to be on a wisdom path, And since wisdom is only wisdom if it's intimately connected with compassion and vice versa, this path business is no more and no less than a difference of emphasis, but it might matter. And I tell you this because it might help you explain why some of what you might be about to get may not be quite what you expected, but that's how we learn. You know? I think if you're a compassion type, then you need to do some logic. If you're a logic type, you need to do some compassion. You know? It's just working both sides of the street. So what is Madhyamaka? It's Buddhism as philosophy. Its founder, indisputably, is Arya Nagarjuna, who's dated around 150 to 250 of the Common Era. And this is a titanic figure in the tradition. He's the father of the great revival of the Dharma, known as the Mahayana, the great way of emptiness. You can translate it. He's venerated as a second Buddha, and slightly amusingly, there are two second Buddhas, because Padmasambhava also gets the title of second Buddha. So he's that important. And he stands amongst the greatest philosophers of all time. The Western world is sort of finally catching up. I noticed there's a piece mentioning Nagarjuna in connection with particle physics and quantum theory and so on in The Guardian recently. If Nagarjuna's made it to The Guardian, you know, you think, wow, it's going to become respectable. You know? Madhyamaka in Sanskrit, I can't stop doing this now, translating it. I looked it up in the Monier-Williams online dictionary. As an adjective, it means middlemost. Yeah? As a noun, it means the interior. So I thought, oh, you could maybe say that Madhyamaka is about dwelling within the uttermost centre. So that nails it to the middle way. You know, anything that is defined in those terms must have a strong connection with the practice of the middle way. To a Buddhist studies historian, Madhyamaka is ancient philosophy, safely tucked away on the history shelves. But my contention is that because Madhyamaka deals in timeless truth, it is therefore of eternal relevance, and therefore never merely ancient, but always contemporary. Yeah? Timelessness means it's always bang up to date. And I think it's indispensable for getting your ducks in some kind of a row if you're serious about tackling the middle way, because it'll give you a conceptual understanding, which is a necessary but not sufficient condition for practice. Now, particularly since I was ordained in 2006, my personal practice as a Madhyamika, which is a practitioner of Madhyamaka, has been concerned with the pursuit of insight through the investigation of Madhyamaka dialectics. So I do this philosophy because I think it has potential to provoke insight. Yeah? That's why it's practice, not just, you know, playing with ideas in sort of Western analytical kind of way. This talk comes out of that practice, using ideas recently published in the Journal of Contemporary Buddhism with the support of the International Committee of the Red Cross, on how Buddhist ethics inform and support the enforcement of international humanitarian law in war and conflict. In 2019, I presented this thinking on contemporary applied Madhyamaka to an International Committee of the Red Cross International Conference in Sri Lanka, in the aftermath of the Sri Lankan Civil War. So that was the kind of the conflict setting, I suppose. A sadly perennial relevance of these ideas has since been demonstrated by the outbreak of war and all too familiar patterns of atrocity in the Ukraine. May justice prevail. Nashi sercia I dumki zotoboyoyu. Our minds and hearts are with you in Ukrainian. Okay. So what is it to think Madhyamaka? Sangha says that it's a very good idea to distinguish what he calls difficulties from problems. Difficulties can be solved on their own level. Problems can only be resolved at a higher level. Now, what does he mean by that? Sangharakshita's dialectics are elegant and impeccable. If you look at, there's a section in the Vimlakirti Nadesha Sutta in his commentary on that, where he just presents some very provocative ideas and so on that. And ask me later if you want to know where that is. But they are invariably, I find, implicit. They are demonstrated rather than analysed, and we don't have much of a tradition of doing dialectical analysis in this movement, so I'm a bit deviant, I suppose, in that sense. My interest is in making dialectics explicit and subjecting them to analysis. This isn't something traditionally that we do, perhaps because philosophy is considered too difficult for the average punter. Well, here's the test. We'll have to see. Yeah? I'm now supposedly retired. I'm running a small gardening cooperative, actually, in the Somerset Levels. But as a youth, when I first got involved with the FWBO, back in that lost world, it was 1979, I worked in and was inspired by the worker co-ops that the FWBO used to run. I was educated and trained as a social scientist, and WBO co-ops led me into a fascination with organisational systems and kicked off my professional career as a hands-on practitioner in the field of organisational development. And I tell you that because I'm in a position to compare Sangharakshita's thinking on difficulties and problems with the academic literature on the identification and resolution of complex systemic problems. And as sometimes happens, not infrequently, you take Sangha, who was self-educated and lived, in a sense, outside the academy and the academic tradition, and you compare it with orthodox academic knowledge, and you keep on seeing correspondences. Yeah? So his view on difficulties and problems being at separate levels it's found elsewhere by some of the most creative and original minds in the field, in my opinion, as well. So I was interested when I saw that. His thinking is multidimensional, and what's typical of his thinking is to tackle an issue by interposing a vertical higher-lower dimension on it to see what happens. So he tends to put that dimension in and say, supposing we saw this on two levels, a lower level and a higher level, what would we get? Yeah? Multidimensional thinking yields the idea that the challenges that we face can usually be mapped as a logical hierarchy. If wisdom starts anywhere, it starts with getting your head around this logical hierarchy. So what's the lower level look like? Now, we all know about this one. We're all too familiar with it because we tend to think that all problems are like this, and they aren't. And that's a really serious setback, because sometimes it's true, but not always. That's a very important point there. So, for example, you either turned up tonight or you didn't. Next week, you can once again either turn up or not. That's a simple binary opposition. You turn up or you don't turn up, yeah? It's exclusive because you can't do both. The oppositions are mutually exclusive. It's what they call a forced choice or a zero-sum paradigm. It's one or the other. And no matter how you look at it, you can't do both, yeah? It's fixed, static, and it's closed in the sense of being capable of closure because it's fully resolved by one choice. I went to the Buddhist Centre tonight, I didn't. Can't do both, as I said, right? The outcome is win-lose, because if you do one, the other sort of loses, in a sense, right? It's a win-lose paradigm, yeah? And that's a true dichotomy. It's a genuine dichotomy. We talk about false dichotomies. Let's start with the true ones, okay? It's not a delusion, okay? Some of reality actually works like this, but not all of it. Now, students of Patittasamutpāda, the Buddhist model of causality, may object that all conditioned phenomena are interconnected. That's true, but in the case of a simple binary, a true dichotomy, that relationship is one of opposition. So they're connected through their opposition. There's a kind of connection. Yeah? What about the higher level then? Yeah, there's your simple either or. Yeah, what I'm calling a simple binary opposition. Right? Now, consider ethics, right? If we consider ethics as simple binary oppositions, I think some rather interesting things happen, because ethics is about doing the right thing, not the wrong thing, right? That's the sort of, at its simplest, that would be what it is. What's ethics, Daddy? Well, it's about doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. The choice matters too, as it shapes karma, so we shouldn't be casual about that. You know, we're aiming to do the right thing, however clever and subtle we get about it. But if we view ethics in purely horizontal terms, we get some problems as we interrogate it. Horizontality, after all, equates right with wrong as equal choices. There's only one dimension here. And so right and wrong are equated. Right? And whilst you might pick one over the other, and it's horizontal in that sense, you'd surely want to say that right is superior to wrong, or what's the point of ethics anyway? Right? So under interrogation, the simple equation of right and wrong begins to look like a false equivalence. So it can be useful to see it like that, but it pushes beyond itself. It can't quite be contained by that. So to assert the superiority of right over wrong is to add the vertical higher-lower dimension. So there's a sort of quick example of how you can resolve that Sangha style by saying, well, let's see it in two dimensions. Yeah? Now, I want to say that ethics clearly make a certain amount of sense in terms of binary opposition as a true dichotomy, because do the right thing, not the wrong thing, makes perfect sense. It's only when you start looking at it that you begin to find that it doesn't quite fit in the box, but it also does fit in the box. So it's an interesting test example, I think. There's a suspicion of false equivalence about it as well, because of the value element that you're forcing into one dimension. As a choice, it makes sense, but you know, there's more to be said, I think. And it points beyond itself in those terms. Okay, so there is a practical solution to this. It looks like a contradiction, but actually it's quite easily resolved. What you can conclude is that basic ethical practice begins as a simple binary by choosing right over wrong. That's its root, and it never goes away. Right? You never get so advanced or clever or wonderfully sophisticated as a practitioner that you can somehow do the wrong thing and get away with it. Okay? They've always got that root. So to me, the root of ethics in that binary right-wrong is important. But with time and experience, we also come to notice that defining and separating right and wrong can get quite tricky. And then we hear about upaya kaushalya, skillful means. Yeah, and we find that ethics also operate on a more complex, higher level as well. So, whilst true simple binaries certainly exist, yeah, in the case of coming to the Buddhist centre, not, and a lot of choices like that, in the specific case of ethics, we see a testing of the boundaries of the simple binary, and we conclude that ethics must also be understood at a higher level. And therefore, ethics as an example offers a bridge between these two levels, because they are actually fundamentally connected, though I want to talk more about how different they are than how connected they are. It's important to do it that way around, I think. Socks on before shoes, yeah? And now for a genuine false dichotomy, okay? That would be the distinction between self and other, or the distinction between psychology and Buddhism, I imagine. You agree with that? That's what Badra was telling you a few weeks back. Now, that distinction between self and other is the basis of the ego, right? That's what it's built on. From the very beginning of life, the conceptual mind operates through a series of decisions to group some phenomena together to the exclusion of others. That's how concepts are formed, yeah? And, we elaborate our construct systems through experience and life, and that's how concepts are constructed, and it constructs them through binary oppositions. Now, sometimes those are valid and sometimes they're not. Yeah? One of the shakiest of those constructions is the foundation of the ego as a simple binary opposition which organises experience into inner, in here, and outer, out there, self versus other. Okay? A very useful strategy, but quite a risky one with there's a lot of thorns and problems around it as well. But it works, even if it is deluded in some way, it actually works because the chaos of pre-egoic experience is successfully managed through the development and use of an ego structure. So that opposition is valid. It's really a question of how it's understood and in what terms that validity operates, because it can be valid or invalid. Okay? If we see life in general, and the spiritual life in particular, as a progression from pre-egoic existence through ego development to eventual transcendence of the ego, it's a pretty standard model, I think, then the ego can be understood in terms of that famous raft simile that I mentioned earlier. It's from the Alaga Dupama Sutta, the simile of the water snake, in the Madhyamaka. And we've all heard the raft simile, but I thought I'd better say where it came from. It's an artificial construction which we build and use to see us across the turbulence, and we leave it behind once we reach the farther shore. So that's one way of looking at the shore, turbulence, farther shore kind of model that is so familiar to all Buddhists. The trouble starts when we hang on to the raft. We fall into the error of reification, of making a thing a thing, of assuming that our conceptual mental constructions are not a convenient and useful strategy, but actually denote ultimately real things. There really is something definitely real out there. Yeah? In Buddhist terms, upon that which is essentially empty of inherent existence, we project and impose a svabhava, own being, inherent existence, as the Tibetans sometimes say, from its own side. Yeah? So svabhava is the understanding that something has a reality from its own side rather than being our construction. And of course the Tibetan dialecticians deny that. And what you're being taken back to then is the idea that actually that self-other distinction is just a very, very useful, indispensable strategy. I think its usefulness can blind you to the fact that it's contingent, a temporary thing. It's scaffolding, not the building itself, if you want. Yeah? So you don't abandon it, you just see it for what it really is. That would be insight, yeah? To understand that this idea of inner and outer, self and other, is just a way of seeing things that make sense and has seen me so far, right? But I might need to question that, I might need to move beyond it at some point. Okay, so What started out as a coping strategy slips into becoming a hard and fast reality through reification if we're not careful. Now, that's not so bad in the case of genuine simple binaries, because if they are, in their inherent logical nature opposed, if you can either come to the Buddhist center or not, then the problem isn't so great. But it has disastrous consequences when it's imposed upon complex problems at the next level up, what Sangha actually calls problems rather than difficulties. In the case of the ego strategy, reifying that and seeing that as an absolute truth of yourself as an inherent phenomenon with svabhava, with inherent existence, atman or soul, then what you have is the first fetter. You have the fixed view of self, which is one of the major sort of boulders in the road, I suppose, along the middle way. Got to be dealt with. I am me in here. I am everything that is not out there, which is true as a way of looking at things, not true as an absolute hard fact. This easily hardens into solipsism, the belief that actually only I am real and all the rest of you are just a figment of my imagination, and a regressed selfish narcissism, which has recently become the signature pathology of numerous prominent public figures. So you can see that all over the place if you want to see solipsistic narcissism. It's quite big at the moment. Wisdom prevents this from happening because it does not forget that concepts are merely what they are. They are merely useful strategies. They're just ways of sorting things into piles. Other sorts and piles can be made. It understands the self-other relationship, not as a simple binary, but as a complex dialectical polarity, which is what this next step up is. Now, that's just an idea at the moment, but I'm going to demonstrate and show you how that works. How do we know when we're dealing with a complex problem which can be resolved by understanding it as a dialectical polarity? Now, one way of doing this, I couldn't find a way of doing it, so I invented one. What's called a DPA, a dialectical process analysis. Anybody who knows anything about polarity management will know it's Johnson's polarity management. Some people in the order know about that. It's kind of developed from that. It's an original method which I developed for the conference paper, which I told you about, and the journal paper. But then again, I stand on the shoulders of giants. It's kind of original, but it makes use of an awful lot of very solid previous kind of thinking. So a little bit of originality, I'll claim, but not a fat lot. It's been accepted by a mass international audience of Buddhists, and it's made it into a peer-reviewed academic journal, soon to be a chapter in a Routledge academic book. So I figure it's past its MOT. At every stage, I was thinking, will I be found out, my imposter syndrome cutting in, and people are going, this is great, love this. And I'm like, okay, let's see how we go. So let's try a DPA, a dialectical process analysis on self and other. And we'll get away from all this appalling abstraction to something concrete, right, which I'm sure you'll want to do. Okay. The basic test is, can we find that pattern of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis within our opposition? Or you won't find it within, I come to the Buddhist center, I don't come to the Buddhist center. That stops, it's closed. All right? That thesis, antithesis, synthesis, some will recognize that as derived from Hegel's dialectic, but it's common to all forms of dialectical logic. Everyone I've ever looked at anyway has that kind of pattern in it, that sort of pattern, yeah? If you can see thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in the relationship, then you've got yourself a dialectical polarity, okay? So, imagine up here, right, this is the upper level, this is the lower level, right? You've still got your opposition, okay? You've got self over here, other there, okay? Let's see what happens if we add the higher-lower dimension. The higher, in this case, could be positive results, successful outcomes, integration, all the good stuff that we recognize as Buddhists. Right down at the bottom would be the negative, disintegrating kind of side of it. Can we fill those boxes? Can we fill that space? That gives us 4 cells, and you can tell I used to be a management consultant because I got a 4-box model. And that's the hallmark of any management consultant, right? The 4-box model. Because it shows 2 levels of 2 independent ideas. That's why it's so popular. If you showed 3, it'd be a 9-box model. So, what is the positive aspect of focusing upon self? It's healthy self-regard, it's a nice, strong, well-developed ego. It's taking care of this precious human body. Yeah? Anybody got any examples? Why would you think about yourself? Yeah?
Survival? Survival?
Yeah.
Feed yourself?
I mean, you can't really be of any use to anybody else unless you take care of yourself. Charity begins at home, I suppose they say, don't they? So there's definitely a group of realities there, right? If you don't agree at any point, shout, okay? But I think there's a real bunch of stuff there. What about the upside of other, okay? Altruism, generosity, shutting up and listening, paying attention, giving people space, a whole load of stuff there, right? And are they really separate? Even though you can separate them, I think you can already see how they're interrelated, yeah? Because you can't really help someone without taking the initiative personally of, maybe approaching them, talking to them, putting yourself in the way of being there. You just come to the Buddhist centre to befriend people. That's what we're told to do. That's a practice, actually. Just come along and befriend people. Sounds a bit clunky and artificial, but, if you do it in the right way, that definitely works. So they are, while separate, also connected, okay? So you've got your thesis and your antithesis, self and other, are clearly interconnected. And if we look at the negatives, let's go down to the negative zone, right? If we separate self from other, right, what we have is selfishness, solipsism, narcissism, all the stuff I mentioned earlier on. There's clearly a group of negative things which are selfish. And selfishness is selfish because it takes self at the exclusion of other. And look what it does. It makes it into an either-or relationship, like the lower level. Well, it's me or them. It's us or them. Okay? It's not. It's both. Right? That's the short answer. But there's a group of phenomena there, all right. And then other at the expense of self. It's a little harder to fill in that one, but that would be self-denial, abnegation, doormat syndrome. Always in endless. Well, I've sacrificed so much for you. We gave her most of our lives, if you know the Beatles song, yeah, Leaving Home. So what you want is a healthy, happy, functioning self that is perfectly capable of being in a relationship with other healthy, happy selves, because you're not a solipsist. You know that, pretty much everybody else's inside is a bit like yours, enough for you to talk anyway and communicate and so on. And Buddhists make a great deal of effort to do that. It can also be broken, and it's broken by taking it at the wrong level. Because it's a complex dialectical polarity, and I'll show you how it moves in a moment, if you take it down to the difficulty level, it breaks, and it breaks into either selfishness or a kind of self-abnegation. And they don't connect. There's no connection between them, yeah? Except you get what's called a double downside of this theory, where everything is dreadful. Okay? So I think you can see there's a thesis and an antithesis there. What about the synthesis then? What happens when the healthy, happy, productive self engages with the other is that they interchange. If you become too focused on self, you'll decline into selfishness. If you notice, you'll move over. And so the antidote to selfishness will be an act of generosity, an act of outreach, communication, reaching to the other pole. If you feel completely exhausted, say you're an order member who's risking burnout through doing lots and lots of classes and stuff for people and worn out, you maybe need to go on a solitary retreat or just stop for a bit and look after yourself and come back up. So there's a flow which interestingly has the shape of an infinity loop here, right? I look after myself, I get a bit selfish, I do something generous and altruistic for the other, I go to the other pole. If that starts to get a bit old and worn out, then I look after me. I get a bit of me time, right? So you can see how that flow goes, and it falls towards the negative, and hopefully notice what it's doing. And these points of inflection really matter, where the curve changes shape, and you move on. Yeah. So that's the shape of a dialectical polarity, and it shows you that self and other are separate and connected in the positive state. Only in the negative state, when they're broken and separated apart, they're being treated at the wrong logical level, do they become highly problematic. Do we agree with that? Does this make sense? Yeah?
It seems
yeah.
to. Yeah.
Okay, you're with me, right? So I think self-other comes out as a complex dialectical polarity. There are versions of it, like, for example, group, individual, and so on. The question of how many there are and which are the key ones is something which I'm still working on. But that, I think, is an incontestable example. And it's the one I'd use for a bunch of Buddhists, because everybody's going to get that self-other thing. That's what overcoming the subject-object dichotomy the duality, is about, really. It's about subject meeting object, object meeting subject, and it's dynamic and it's moving, it's in a dance, okay? So, the logical relationship is both and, not either or, right? Positives only arise when the poles are interconnected and moving together, yeah? Therefore, it must be, they're mutually inclusive, not mutually exclusive, right? The dialectical resolution of self and other is communication. That's what communication is. It's self meeting other, other meeting self. You can just see in any conversation. So even though this is supposedly advanced Indian philosophy, it's actually as common an experience as having a chat with somebody you like. Yeah, it's that down to earth. And that, again, I think gives it a Buddhist quality. The ideas are massive. The actual experience of it is just a straightforward kind of happy event. Very Buddhist, that, I would say. Are both upsides necessary and desirable? Yep. All right. There's a validity check on whether it's a complex dialectical polarity. Is there a synthesis of the upsides? Yeah, well, this is what happens when you get into communication and you kind of forget that you're you and they're them. You just find a sort of common process of meeting, and you're not quite sure who said what. I did a mentoring thing at the council years ago when I worked there, and I asked these people doing a bit of feedback, and they said, how was it? We said, well, there was a time we forgot who we were. It was a peculiar thing, slightly odd, but, so we were thinking for each other. And I'm like, you've just transcended the subject-object duality just through being in good conversation. And you've experienced it as a weird thing that happened. Was that supposed to happen? I think, well, we hope it does, because when we organise things, we'd like a superstar result like that. But, we got it. So I've actually seen, people who wouldn't think of themselves as remotely kind of into weird stuff, if you like, or philosophy and so on, just reporting that when we're mentoring, we had a conversation. You must have experienced this, that thing where the minds just meet. So that's why, in a sense, there's three levels, because there's simple binary oppositions. Then there's the dialectical flow. And then when they meet, right, there's a transcendence. And I think that's the bridge. That's how come this dynamic, both and flowing way of looking at complex things points the way to non-duality, to what I might want to call transcendence. Yeah? That's how Madhyamaka makes the bridge. Yeah? Does synthesis point towards transcendence into non-duality? Yeah, it does. Self-other can definitely become a kind of group mind us. It can definitely be an experience like that, where it just sort of falls away. Are there negative consequences of breaking the relationship? Are there downsides? Yep, we discussed those. So it's past all the kind of tests for a DPA. In all key respects, self-other comes out as a complex dialectical polarity. In contrast to the simple binary, the logical relationship is both and. Positives only arise when the poles are interconnected, and so on. It's inclusive because success involves balancing the poles. It's like riding a bike or the to and fro oscillating exchange of a good conversation. The poles are mutually inclusive. If you lean too much to the right or left on your bike, you fall off. If all you do is steer to the right or left, you only go in circles. Right? There must be an interchange between the two. And riding a bike's a great example because you have to keep pedalling for anything to happen at all. In the dialectical world, you are pedaling, you are moving. Okay? It is definitely dynamic. Yeah? Fluid, dynamic, open. You can't close it. That's the problem with it. It can only be managed, so it will flow, and it might break. So you've got to manage it. Managing it is about knowing when to shut up and listen, knowing when to say something, to say the right thing, the skillfulness of communication, ethical skillfulness, yeah? Knowing when to interrupt a complex process, give it a bit of a steer. Yeah? But you can't really fix it. You can just manage it. You can steer it. Yeah? The outcome is win-win, because success gets you the best of both worlds. It softens duality, provides a bridge between the hard duality of the binary and the non-dual. It also means, though, that the outcome is potentially lose-lose. When you've got a win-win, when it goes wrong, you get a lose-lose. Yeah? You get a kind of selfishness and alienation at the same time. I think we see quite a lot of that in societies that don't work, rather like our own, in some respects. Yeah? No, self-other is not a dichotomy, but a dialectical polarity, and that's what complexity looks like. That's what I tried to do there, is to show you how a dialectical complexity, which you're very, very familiar with, but might not have thought of in those terms, is what it is. Yeah? No wonder Socrates was so keen on dialogue. Socrates' thing was, if we just talk about it, we'll get to the truth quicker than if I just think about it on my own. Dialogue, dialectic, yeah? No wonder the Buddhist tradition places such emphasis on communication. Also, no wonder that a standard method of the ruling class has always been to divide and rule by violently imposing a propaganda of binary simplicity upon what is really a complex reality. When you hear you're either one of us or one of them, I suggest you be a good Buddhist. You be skeptical, alert, wise in the uses of dialectic, aware of the true nature of complexity and that it's being done violence to. Our world is afflicted by polarization. Polarization as a means of social and political control involves that familiar pattern, the violent imposition of a propaganda of binary simplicity upon what is actually a complex reality. If you want to be free of it, if you want to control your mind rather than having your mind controlled, that is if you really want to develop wisdom, because that's what it is, amongst other things, then you have to understand the true nature of the simple binary and the nature of complex dialectic. And if you're a Buddhist practitioner, you've got a sort of front row seat for that process, because that's where the practice, I think, will lead you if you pursue it seriously. What do the Buddhist masters have to say in this general vein? It struck me that understanding self-other for what it is, not a binary opposition, but as a dialectical polarity, that may be what the Zen tradition means when it says all we really need to do is to make progress, is to get out of our own way. If you stop thinking of it as a hard and fast duality and accept it as a fluid process, that's a bit like getting out of your own way. So it struck me that that's consistent with some of what Zen says. In his commentary upon the Satipatthana Sutta, Sangha says, before insight has been developed, there's always some oscillation, however subtle or refined, between pairs of opposites. So there's Sangha being unusually explicit, actually, like, yeah, okay, that's exactly like the upper part of a dialectical polarity analysis map, that oscillation. And he's talking about synthesis, yeah? Dogen says, I love this one, Dogen says that the dialectical intimacy of light and darkness is obvious. They seem like opposites, but the plain fact is that in pure light and pure darkness, we see nothing. Dogen, quote, "The world is revealed to us only through degrees of shadow." That's the guy who invented Soto Zen, so you want to take him fairly seriously, I think. To Katyayana, his senior disciple, the Buddha said, by and large, this world is in bondage to attachments, grasps after systems, and is imprisoned by dogmas. But one such as this, meaning the Buddha, does not become involved with or cling to these attachments, fixations of awareness, mental obsesses, and dogmatic biases. And in a famous line, he says, the Tathagata teaches the Dhamma via the middle. Yeah? That's one of the statements of the middle way. The other one is, it's the very first thing he says in the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, when he does that first sermon in the Deer Park. You must all know about that. The first thing he says that triggers Kondanya's enlightenment is, it's the middle way, and Kondanya's already going. Now, I thought it was the Four Noble Truths or something. If you look at it, if you look at the actual sutta, you'll see he tells him it's the middle way, and Kondanya's already with him. And that's the first communication of the Dharma in this universe, so it matters. That's what did it. Padmasambhava, finally, says, and this is from a clear seeing through naked awareness, which is a Terama text, that's a Dzogchen text as well. Now, when you are introduced to your own intrinsic awareness, the method for entering into it involves three considerations. Thoughts in the past are clear and empty and leave no traces behind. Thoughts in the future are fresh and unconditioned by anything. And in the present moment, when your mind remains in its own condition without constructing anything, awareness at that moment is itself quite ordinary. Quite ordinary. And when you look into yourself in this way nakedly without any discursive thoughts, since there is only this pure observing, there will be found a lucid clarity without anyone being there who is the observer. Only a naked manifest awareness is present. This awareness is empty and immaculately pure, not being created by anything whatsoever. It is authentic and unadulterated, without any duality of clarity and emptiness. It is permanent, and yet it is not created by anything. However, it is not a mere nothingness or something annihilated, because it is lucid and present. What he's doing here is pairs of opposites and saying it's not this, it's not that. Yeah? Madhyamaka method, actually. It's not this, it's not that. Well, what is it then? You've got to see the interplay between them as the thing it is. It is permanent, and yet it is not created by anything. Not a mere nothingness or something annihilated because it is lucid and present. It does not exist as a single entity because it is present and clear in terms of being many. On the other hand, it is not created as a multiplicity of things because it is inseparable and of a single flavour. It's singular, but no, it's not. It's multiple, but no, it's not. This inherent self-awareness does not derive from anything outside itself. This is the real introduction to the actual condition of things.